Hello, friends. I'm George Kors, and today we're talking about Midnight's Children by famed Indian writer Salman Rushdie. Quite the novel to talk about here today. One of the 20th century's perhaps most hyped up novels, at least in its time, perhaps, in the English language. And I'm looking forward to talking about this with you. It is a jam packed, long, thick novel. My edition is clocks in at over 550 pages. Maybe not too long for some of you, but long for a lot of us. Before we get into Salman Rushdie and his wonderful novel here, I want to say if you like my videos and you want to support me as a writer and thinker, you can buy my novel. My new novel, Sing Lazarus, was published in June of this year. Here it is, all in its beautiful, wonderful glory. You can buy this. Link for that is down below. And whenever you buy my work or talk about it or give my novels to somebody, if you buy Always the Wanderer, my debut, or Sing Lazarus, my second novel, it means a lot. It's the biggest way that you can support me, and it's really, really impactful. So thank you for that. And to everybody who's out there reading my new novel, thank you so much, and keep posting and keep hyping me up. I really appreciate everything that everybody's done to support that. So let's talk about Midnight's Children. Midnight's Children is probably Rushdie's most famous novel, competing with another, The Satanic Verses. Um, so up top, we'll sort of talk a little bit about Rushdie, the person, before getting into Midnight's Children, because I think it's important to sort of foreground some of the sort of stuff surrounding Rushdie and the sort of persona that he's had in the late 20th century, early 21st century. Um, and a big part of that is Rushdie is really outspoken. And if you have read Midnight's Children, or if you read Midnight's Children, that will be evident to you. If you read, Rushdie's criticism or other fiction, that will be evident to you as well. That Rushdie comes from a place of speaking in a very outspoken manner, and that translates into his fiction and translates into another novel of his called The Satanic Verses, which I think I might have a copy of back there. Um, the Satanic Verses includes a very controversial depiction of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And that is a huge faux pas, in the religion of Islam. And for that reason, Rushdie caused a lot of controversy in the 1990s and early 2000s with this novel and with that writing. Resulted in a very famous fatwa issued against Salman Rushdie. That is something that is, part of his persona. Definitely a lot of commentary in Midnight's Children as well about religious extremism, not just with regards to Islam, but towards other religions as well. So that's something to, sort of consider with Rushdie the person. There's some possible sort of 1915 to 1920s era, or 1920s, pardon me, everybody, 2020, 2015 to 2020, yeah, 100 years ago. No, about a decade ago, it's possible that Rushdie was involved with some sort of turf commentary. I've poked around on the internet a little bit, and I haven't found too much outside of him just kind of being, kind of cagey about the subject, which some people are, strangely, and I don't get. But that aside, this is not like a J.K. Rowling situation or anything like that. And also in 2022, Rushdie was attacked in Western New York, was going to give a lecture and was attacked at Western New York. And that, that sort of, it may or may not be a result of Rushdie being a really outspoken individual in the literary scene and the cultural scene. Now, the 20th century had plenty of male authors who fashioned themselves as being maybe button pushers, or people who are crossing the line a little bit, intentionally playing with faux pas and taboo. We might think of Nabokov and his approach of taboo in the 1960s. We might think of somebody who I don't think did a great job of it, but claimed to sort of be a provocateur in William H. Gass, somebody like that. Rushdie, I think, probably is of those 20th century writers, one of the most successful in my mind in the way that his writing really can be evocative and provocative. And I think Midnight's Children is a really important example of that. And I don't intend to turn you off from Salman Rushdie by talking about this up top. I just want to situate that in the conversation because Rushdie is a really important writer for another major reason, which is this sort of post-colonial moments, which I'm going to talk about later, and is in and of itself controversial. And as a person who is sort of situated within post-coloniality myself, within what I've studied, even the term post-colonial itself is a little controversial because it centers on the European actions of colonization. But if we're pausing that debate, Rushdie and Midnight's Children both are very important to a lot of the discourse that was going on in a decade like the 1980s, where there was a lot of significant academic discourse regarding what was happening in countries that had felt the brunt and exploitation of the European colonial project. Um, we're seeing works like Orientalism by Edward Said, for example, be extremely influential during this time. That leads to the 1990s, where we're seeing Benedict Anderson, of course, the great Homi Bhabha, Dr. Bhabha, and others writing and engaging about these ideas of, what happens to cultures and societies when that gigantic colonial power leaves, however we phrase that. And this novel, Midnight's Children, is an important part of that discourse. It is an important object in the English language for us to refer to that era, which still, of course, we're seeing it have its ramifications now. Turn on the news in any language, and you're going to see that. The sort of how are these interconnected histories going back to when European countries had formal settler colonies in other places. How does that look now? We might think of some noteworthy examples, et cetera, et cetera. So for that reason, Rushdie's Midnight's Children is a really, really important novel. The other, reason I would say is really interesting, I'll talk about in style later, is the magical realism of Midnight's Children, which does relate it to a couple of the examples and books I'm going to recommend later. So let's get into Midnight's Children itself. This novel is fairly long. Like I said, my edition is about 550 pages, 552 to be exact. And also my trade paperback, I had to do a lot of book surgery. It's fallen apart. You see, I've lost all sorts of corners and everything to it. This is in 3 books, and that first book. So books 1, 2, and 3. Book 1 is more historical and familial. The narrator of the novel is Salim Sinai, and we are seeing everything in that first person perspective. But book 1 takes place before the narrator is born, before Salim is born. So we get a little bit of historical and familial backgrounding there. That section, book 1, definitely establishes our origins of this very large family that we are dealing with throughout the novel. And there's all sorts of little, various characters that pop in and out, various patriarchs and matriarchs that are sort of important to the action of the novel and Salim's experience, both historically and personally. What is really striking to me about book 1 is its sort of depictions of British colonial era India, and how that is affecting the family and interacting with the family's experiences and sometimes filtering the family's experiences. That also we begin seeing, when I think the historical things that Salman Rushdie does really excellently throughout Midnight's Children is depict the downfall of the sort of British colony, um, and that in book one is really, it's worth reading Midnight's Children just to have the experience of learning about that era of the European colonial project and to observe, even through a novel, that sort of inner workings with, cultures and individuals and peoples and personal lives and so on and so forth. So book one to me, I think is really important. And you know, the novel really does need that historical grounding, because of what happens at Salim's birth. Um, so to sort of finish up on book one here, we're building and building towards Salim being born and relating his story to the reader. Um, and as Salim is narrating all of this, what I would say here is, it's very tongue in cheek. It can be very funny. And nonetheless, we get this very clear depiction of a hybrid origin, a culturally hybrid origin. And I think this is probably one of the facets of Midnight's Children that is maybe the most remarkable to me, or up there, maybe not to use superlatives, significantly remarkable to me, is his depiction of cultural hybridity and just how murky that is. That's really important to me personally. I think it's important to a lot of people personally, just because you know our families are mixed or muddled in different cultures, um, and that I think is really really provocative and interesting. That idea that the cultures are mixing for better or for worse. Um, you know, for example, Salim's family, where they settle, and where they live, is like this almost bizarro British compound, that is sold to them. This house is sold to them by this vacating British settler colonizer. Um, it's actually really really interesting, and I think for that reason alone, and book one alone, I would say it is well worth a read. So back to our narrator. Salim is building up to his birth. Now, what happens at his birth? He and a lot of other people are born at the stroke of midnight, at the very moment, I guess in 1947, precisely on that August 15th moment when India is granted, um, independence from 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 the British. And for that reason, Salim and the other Midnight's Children, so there's the title, the other Midnight's Children possess special powers. Um, and into book two, we see a relation of Salim's childhood and the family dynamic that's going on there. And I'm not going to summarize too much of the family dynamic because there's so many different characters and there's so much going on there. And I don't want to spoil any of that sort of stuff for folks who care about spoilers. I don't particularly care myself, but you know, whatever. Um, to that end, we start to see, Salim's childhood. The really interesting part about book two, and I think this, I think books one and two, pardon me, are probably my favorite of the three. Though, book two really talks about the emergence of this independent political state and that sort of beginnings of the political India and the Nehrus and the Gandhis and just all of the different various powers at hand, are really really interesting to me, and I think historically very interesting. The story of the family itself is very interesting, of course, and Salim's special powers and the powers of the other Midnight's Children is, these are all very cool. This is you know there's a lot of magical realism throughout. I don't want to downplay it, but it gets really to sort of a fever pitch in book two. A lot of that magical realist sensibility. So if that's something that you like, maybe look into Midnight's Children. But in terms of the sort of socio-historical and the socio-political perspective, book two is really interesting for that reason of looking at the new nation, looking at the new country, and how it's, setting itself up to be successful and whatever those failures and non-failures are. Um, and this is where I would talk about, those post-colonial moments. And I mentioned that a little bit up top, and I want to mention it again, mainly because, you know, for a person like me, when I, finished my graduate degree, when I finished my master's degree, that was situated in post-colonial studies. That's a convenient way for me to talk about the philosophies and histories and criticism that relate to a colonial power leaving a country. And notice that that sentence, the subject of that sentence is a colonial power. There's a problem here, which is that we need to situate things, uh, you know, and represent the people who were there, the indigenous people or the people who lived in that place and were subjected to, that colonial experience for however long, violent, good or bad it was. That is a difficult, theoretical thing for a lot of us to grapple with, and is something that we'll probably, continue grappling with indefinitely. Um, but in book two, I think there is a lot to be said for, teaching book two in coordination with many of the texts that were sort of contemporaneous to Midnight's Children, and seeing sort of a lot of this thinking, this post-colonial thinking, or this, maybe Western Asian or Indian thinking, as it related to, you know, countries finally seizing independence and European powers, you know, ending the formal colonial project that had been ongoing for a very long time. I've talked about other videos. I've talked about other novels on the channel, and I have videos about those down below. Algerian Cavalcade, Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade being a significant one of them. To that end, there's a lot of discourse throughout Northern Africa, Western Asia, India, and so on. There's so many other places, and of course, throughout South America as well, Central America, and the list goes on. The colonial project was a huge human undertaking, and that era, from the end of the Second World War, 1945 on through, basically up until the 1990s, we see, such significant political changes across the globe. And reading book two of Midnight's Children is really evocative for, the growing pains that are associated with what was going on historically in that era. And, it's also evocative of the successes, and the victories and the joy, that was ongoing in that era as well. I think that's something that's, worth revisiting today, especially considering that I think post-colonial studies and, my field and other people's fields has become really, popularized. A lot of the language of the post-colonial scholar has become pretty broadly used in other various places outside of academe and literary circles, like social media. We see people using terms like colonizer, pretty widely in various places. And that, I think visiting with literature that is situated in that sort of moment, philosophically and historically, is really well worth your while. Part three, book three, Salim is older. Book three, the end of book two and book three become very, very much so entrenched and more contemporary to Rushdie's time in the 1980s, late 1970s and early 1980s. They become much more deeply entrenched in sort of social and political commentary to that contemporary moment. And, we see, various acts of war. We see, a coup. We see, various political figures and other famous incidents that were happening in India and Pakistan. There's a lot of, uh, through book 2 into book 3, as we talk about the partition and the splitting of India into different states, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and those moments are significant moments of um, uproar, for lack of a better word. We see moments of war, in Bangladesh, for example, and that book 3 particularly has a lot of active commentary, and that's where I think a lot of Rushdie as an outspoken person comes out, as an outspoken thinker and writer comes out. And if you are a person who's deeply interested in um, Indian history, for example, I think Midnight's Children is a must read to that end. As controversial as Rushdie has been as an individual, I think just the perspective and the way that he articulates the criticisms of the governments of Pakistan and India is really, really interesting. And it's interesting from a historical and socio-political perspective, to be sure. And I think that's as much as I'll say sort of about the summary of the piece. Throughout all of this, Salim has varying experiences with these powers where he can sort of hear the other Midnight's Children. Um, but I think I'll leave that as the summary and just sort of try to encourage you to engage with, Rushdie's Midnight's Children as a, historical document as well as a fun novel to read. Um, and I think one of the things that is going to draw a lot of people into this that probably isn't what I was all just talking about in terms of the sort of social and political, and historical lenses that we might apply here. I think the magical realism of the piece might be part of that. The style, there is a pretty significant amount of sort of whimsy and that sort of magical whimsy that is happening um, in a lot of novels in the 20th century. And I think, that if that's, your cup of tea, and you've read, various other magical realists, I think, Midnight's Children is definitely well worth your read. Because there's, there, and it has those sort of that flavor. Um, Maybe that's not the right word. It has that sort of sensibility of the sort of whimsical, that these sort of uncanny events that are happening throughout the novel that might be of interest to folks. Lots of non sequitur moments in a novel like Midnight's Children. And also, what I would say about Rushdie, the person, and why it might be important to sort of consider, hey, I should read Midnight's Children, is because of his hybrid voice. Rushdie was born, you know, in India, lived his youth in India, and then later moved to the UK for school. Now, this is a really formative kind of experience, and it's something that it really merits mentioning because the tone and the voice and a lot of the actions and a lot of the coincidences throughout a novel like Midnight's Children do depict and portray for us a kind of cultural hybridity. The hybrid of the indigenous Indian person whose family has been here for however many generations, and the person who is affected and has some aspects of British culture as well, from the colonial project. And the mixture of these differing aspects of culture are really, really important to Midnight's Children. And on this read, that is probably what stuck out the most to me. More than Rushdie's voice, more than the magical realism of the piece, the cultural hybridity of the novel really, really was loud for me this time, and I think it was really excellently done, and that's the best thing that Rushdie, I think, again using superlatives, that's one of the best things that Rushdie does in this novel, in my opinion. I do think that there's a chance in book one, especially, that Rushdie's tone is a little braggadocious, and for that reason, it's a little masculine, it's a little braggadocious, and to that end, it might be a turnoff for some people. I found myself a little annoyed with Salim at points because there's a lot of sort of masculine bragging that's happening in book one. But that aside, the cultural hybridity of it, and once we start to see the varying machinations of Salim's family and the culture and their, the moves that they make between different locations, and the experiences that they have in India and Pakistan and Salim and Bangladesh, these experiences are really, really, really important to gaining an understanding, a nuanced understanding, even possibly, of what is happening in this place where there was a huge monolithic political power that was not native to that area. That political power left, and what do we have afterwards? That is, really, really interesting. And one of the things that Rushdie doesn't shy away from is, sort of observing with comedy and sometimes tragedy, the intermingling of these various cultures. Because it's not just two, it's not just British and Indian. There's, countless religions and subcultures and languages. And that is what is really excellent about, Rushdie's writing in Midnight's Children are the other Midnight's Children, not just Salim, all over, this once this moment of independence is had, all over these children who are born at the stroke of midnight, they all represent different regions and different ideas and religions and cultures and experiences, and that is just really, really well done. In my opinion, I think it's very well done, and I think it's really, really worth a read. And I think secondarily, Rushdie's magical realism is interesting in and of itself. It's that if that's something that you're really, really interested in, I think you should go for it. But for me, I would encourage a reading of it with the lens of looking at cultural hybridity. Um, to that end, let's talk about some recommendations here, because the first one that I have, I is a scholar I mentioned earlier. Homi Bhabha's The Location of Culture. You know, I can't think of a better work to pair with Midnight's Children other than The Location of Culture, because of this this reading that I just did and how much I was focused on cultural hybridity. Um, I think that cultural hybridity thread there is really rich. It's really provocative and interesting. Um, you know, I think also, looking at social media and looking at literary, expressions on YouTube or Instagram or other places, I don't see a lot of discussions of cultural hybridity. I see a lot of discussions of individual cultures and individual cultural experiences and religious experiences and linguistic experiences. But I don't see a lot of discussion of the intermingling of those, various factors. And I think, Homi Bhabha, Dr. Bhabha is so brilliant in articulating that in The Location of Culture. And then, cross reading that with Midnight's Children could be a really interesting project. I think if you're out there really interested in this. Um, my next recommendation that I would have is from Agha Shahid Ali. Personal one on this, The Half Inch Himalayas is such a beautiful work, and I all of Ali's poetry is really, really fantastic. But I know somebody from Ali's family, so it's important work to me, and it's just one of those things that I think, if you're looking for the post-colonial, and you want to have a really, the quote unquote post-colonial, you want to have a really quick introduction to that. This, this short book of poems, it is so small, less than 60 pages. Um, you know, and this poem, um, Postcard from Kashmir, just knocks my socks off every single time. Yeah, the half-inch Himalayas in my hand. It's unbelievably beautiful, and really, if you're looking for a way to get into more complicated sort of cultural and critical and philosophical discussions of something like the era after the colonial project ended, half-inch Himalayas, you can't go wrong, and just such a beautiful writer. I have pretty much all his works here. Last but not least, I recommend this, with a little caveat. A lot of folks are going to compare Midnight's Children, including the back of my own edition, mentions this novel, Cien Años de Soledad by Gabriel Garcia Márquez. A lot of people are going to mention this novel, 100 Years of Solitude. Okay. That's a fine comparison on the merits that this is magical realism. And, when Garcia Marquez published this, was eventually marketed, and made to be a really, really big deal. And, folks started looking at this magical realist, identification of literature. And, Cien Años de Soledad is really beautiful, of course. So people are going to recommend this. They're going to recommend Garcia Marquez. Allow me to posit that Garcia Marquez might not be the most apt recommendation. Instead, I would say it is Die Blechtrommel from Günter Grass. Günter Grass, also a relatively late, not controversial in his life, although very politically active in Germany, was somewhat controversial late in his life for having been affiliated with the Hitlerjugend, but for most of his life was relatively outspoken. This novel by Günter Grass, I think, might be the more apt comparison, and that is because Günter Grass's main character in here is Oscar Mazarat. Oscar has a bizarre superpower. He has trouble growing up. He has a really distinct voice. He is the voice of the novel. So in that way, I think, between these two, between Die Blechtrommel and, Midnight's Children, that might be the other magical realist novel I might recommend here. Now, don't get me wrong. I think, in a lot of ways, Cien Años de Soledad would be really interesting to cross-read with Midnight's Children because of the familial aspect and because of the large family of characters and because, of course, of the magical realist side of things. However, Günter Grass's Blechtrommel also has a lot of that magical realist sensibility to it, although it is kind of a different vibe. This is a World War II novel. It's kind of not satirizing, but forcing the sort of atrocities and horrors of fascism into the absurd. And I think that is something I also see a little bit of a connection with Midnight's Children, which a little bit in the voice of Rushdie pushes the horrors of trying to grapple with the colonial project into the absurd as well. So I would recommend, if you're looking for another 20th century heavy hitter magical realist novel, to look at Günter Grass and Die Blechtrommel, but you're absolutely going to see people recommending Cien Años de Soledad. So this is sort of a 2-for-1 recommendation on that, because I think a lot of your copies of Midnight's Children are going to mention 100 Years of Solitude by name, but I don't know that I have seen folks mentioning Die Blechtrommel, the tin drum. Sorry, I haven't even said it in English. I apologize. So, all things said, I think, Midnight's Children, still holds up as a really, really provocative and interesting novel. I really, really enjoy it. I definitely enjoyed it more on the first read than I did on the second read. But on the second read, I had a really enriching experience looking for that cultural hybridity. And that is what I think I'm going to come back to time and time again in this novel. is, wow, look at the cultural hybridity that, Rushdie depicts. You consider what he's experienced as an individual person, between cultures. I'm almost reminded at times of Season of Migration to the North by Tayeb Saleh. So lots to consider here. Definitely a novel well worth the read if you're looking for a long novel. And this, Rushdie writes in English, so originally written in English. Thank you all for being here today. Like I said up top, if you want to support me, please buy my work. My new novel, Sing Lazarus, is out. You can learn more about me at georgekors.com. Learn more about me as a thinker and writer. Head there, and you can follow me on social medias. I may or may not use at gbk7288. And you have my thanks for watching today. Let me know if you're going to read Midnight Children, or if you've read it, what your feelings are. And I hope your reading practice is going well. I hope you're safe. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.